Doobity Utra Tubineros. Okay, well, it looks like NATO is up to its old tricks again. From the New York Times of December 17th, 2011, we have the lead article in Strikes on Libya by NATO, an unspoken civilian toll, by C.J. Shivers and Eric Schmidt, dated Tripoli, Libya. And it says that in NATO's 7-month air campaign in Libya, hailed by the alliance and many Libyans for blunting a lethal crackdown by Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi and helping to push him from power, it came with an unrecognized toll. As usual, scores of civilian casualties the alliance has long refused to acknowledge or investigate, which is business as usual. By NATO's telling during the war, and in statements since the sorties ended on Halloween, the alliance-led operation was nearly flawless, as always, a model air war that used high technology and meticulous planning and restraint to protect civilians from Colonel Gaddafi's troops, which was the alliance's mandate. We have carried out this operation very carefully, says the Secretary General of NATO, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, in November, without confirmed civilian casualties. The usual standard bullshit line. Because on an on-the-ground examination by the paper itself, the New York Times, of the airstrike sites across Libya, including interviews with survivors, doctors, witnesses, the collection of munitions remnants, medical reports, death certificates, and photographs, it found, as usual, credible accounts that NATO is full of shit. It found accounts of dozens of civilians killed by NATO in many distinct attacks. The victims included at least 29 women and children, and who had often been asleep in homes when the ordnance hit. In all, there's at least 40 and maybe more than 70 killed by NATO at these sites, according to the available evidence. And while that's not a high total compared with the mass bombings in Iraq and Afghanistan, in which bombs by Allied aircraft killed more than that at one blow, and it may have been less than the account circulated by Gaddafi, and it's also not a complete accounting. It does show them to be errant liars, as always, totally callous as to the suffering that they caused, and I would add, as we will see further on, that it was intentional suffering. The survivors and doctors working for the anti-Gaddafi interim authorities, the puppets now in charge, pointed dozens more civilian wounded in these and other strikes, and they referred reporters to other sites where civilian casualties were suspected. An act of bravery on their part, no doubt, because as the totals mount, the cover-ups will also roll in tandem. 2 weeks after being provided a 27-page memorandum from the Times containing the extensive details of 9 separate attacks, in which evidence indicated that the Allied planes had killed or wounded unintended victims, NATO then backtracked. Said Oana Lungescu, a spokeswoman for NATO headquarters in Brussels, "From what you have gathered on the ground, it appears that innocent civilians may have been killed or injured despite all care and precision. We deeply regret any loss of life," which is, of course, bullshit, because if they deeply regretted it, they wouldn't have gone in for this pattern of bombing in the first place. She added that NATO was in regular contact with the new Libyan government, its puppets, and that we stand ready to work with the Libyan authorities to do what they feel is right, which will, of course, be anything you say. But, of course, NATO, as usual, deferred the responsibility of initiating any inquiry to Libya's interim authorities, their puppets, whose survival and climb to power were made possible largely by the airstrike campaign. And, as usual, so far these Libyan leaders have expressed no interest in examining NATO's mistakes, which, of course, includes their coming to power in the first place. The failure to thoroughly assess the civilian toll reduces the chances, of course, that Allied forces, which are relying ever more heavily on air power, rather than risking ground troops in overseas conflict, spilling its own blood for its own principles, preferring to outsource war using native contractors, will examine their Libyan experience to minimize collateral deaths elsewhere. Allied commanders have been ordered to submit a lessons learned report to NATO headquarters in February. NATO's incuriosity about the many lethal accidents will raise questions about how thorough that review will be, which is, of course, about as thorough as a prostate examination. NATO's experiences in Libya also reveals an attitude that initially prevailed in Afghanistan. There, NATO forces, the U.S. in particular, tightened its rules of engagements for its airstrikes and insisted on better targeting only after it repeatedly ignored and disputed the accounts of airstrikes that left many civilians dead, got called on it, and then had to backtrack. In Libya, the NATO inattention to its unintended victims has also left many wounded civilians with little aid in the aftermath of the country's still chaotic change in leadership, and this aid will only recede once again the more it comes to light. These victims included a boy blasted by debris in his face and right eye, a woman whose left leg was amputated, another whose foot and leg wounds left her disabled, a North Korean doctor whose left foot was crushed, and his wife who suffered a fractured skull. But at least they won't have to worry about the suffering of the transition process in their homeland. NATO has conveniently spared them from that. The Times investigation included visits to more than 25 sites, including in Tripoli, Serman, Mizda, Zlitan, Gaya, Meir, Ashdabaya, Misrata, Sirte, Briga, and Sabrata, and near Benghazi. More than 150 targets, bunkers, buildings, or vehicles were hit at these places. NATO warplanes flew thousands of sorties that dropped altogether 7,700 bombs and missiles. Because the reporters for the Times did not examine sites in several cities and towns where the air campaign was active, the casualty estimate could be low and most likely is. While there's indications that the alliance took many steps to avoid harming civilians and often didn't damage civilian infrastructure useful to Colonel Gaddafi's military, that some elements of two American-led air campaigns in Iraq, like using of cluster bombs and so forth, appear to have been avoided, and also avoided were including attacks on electrical grids. And these steps spared civilians certain hardships and risks that accompanied previous Western air-to-ground operations, and that it may have used only fixed-wing aircraft, which dropped only laser or satellite-guided weapons, and did not use the so-called dumb bombs. And while the overwhelming preponderance of strikes seemed to have hit their targets without killing non-combatants, altogether there were many factors that undercut this alleged humanitarian bombing mission. They're citing technically faulty bombs, poor dated intelligence, and the so-called near absence of experienced military personnel on the ground who could help direct the airstrikes. The apparent assumption by NATO that residences thought to harbor pro-Gaddafi forces were not occupied by civilians repeatedly proved mistaken, posing a reminder to advocates of air power that no war is cost or error-free, and as we shall see, is not bullshit or lie-free either. The investigation also found significant damage to civilian infrastructure from certain attacks, for which a rationale was not evident, or risks to civilians were clear. These included strikes on warehouses that current anti-Gaddafi guards said contained only food, or near businesses or homes that were destroyed, including an attack on a munitions bunker beside a neighborhood that caused a large secondary explosion, scattering warheads and toxic rocket fuel. NATO has not yet provided data to Libyans on the locations or types of unexploded ordnance from its strikes and what to look out for as they comb through the rubble of the existing damage. At least 2 large weapons were present at sites visited by the Times. Said Dr. Ali Yawa, chief surgeon at the Zlitan Hospital, this information is urgently needed. Moreover, the scouring of one strike site found remnants of NATO munitions in a ruined building that an alliance spokesman explicitly said NATO did not attack. That's a mistake. A pair of strikes killed 12 anti-Gaddafi fighters and nearly killed a civilian ambulance crew aiding wounded men. And underscored NATO's sometimes tenuous grasp of battle lines and raised questions about the tenuous forthrightness and accuracy of the alliance's public relations campaign. The second strike pointed to a tactic that survivors at several sites recounted: warplanes restriking targets a minute after a first attack, a practice that imperiled and sometimes killed civilians rushing to the wounded. This means a deliberate targeting of civilians in repeated attacks, knowing that the second attacks would kill and maim those seeking to rescue the wounded from the first. This is deliberate terror bombing. Pressed about the dangers posed to non-combatants by such attacks, NATO said it would reconsider the tactics rationale in its internal campaign review. Colonel Julian says that that's a valid point to take into consideration in future operations, and one that will be ignored and tabled also in the future. That statement was a shift in the alliance's stance. NATO's response to allegations of mistaken attacks had long been carefully worded denials and insisted that its operations were devised and supervised with exceptional care. Faced with credible allegations that it killed civilians and that its denials are outright BS, the alliance said it had neither the capacity for nor intention of investigating, and often repeated that disputed strikes were sound. So that while it admits that it may have been mistaken, it doesn't care. The alliance maintained this position even after two independent Western organizations, Human Rights Watch and the Campaign for Innocent Victims in Conflict, or CIVIC, met privately with NATO officials and shared their field research about the mistakes, including, in some cases, victims' names and the dates and locations where they died. Organizations researching civilian deaths in Libya said that NATO's resistance to making itself accountable and acknowledging mistakes amounted to poor public policy. But then what does one expect from people who are used to killing with impunity? It's crystal clear that civilians died in NATO strikes, said Fred Abrahams, a researcher for Human Rights Watch, but this whole campaign is shrouded by an atmosphere of impunity and by NATO's and their puppet authorities' mutually congratulatory statements. Their own people, as always, are expendable to the larger policy goals. Mr. Abrams added that the matter went beyond the need to assist civilians harmed by airstrikes, though he said that was important. At issue was who was going to lose their lives in the next campaign because these errors and mistakes went unexamined and no one learned from them. Human Rights Watch and CIVIC also noted that the alliance's stance on civilian casualties and costs in Libya was at odds with its practices for so-called collateral damage in Afghanistan. Their public anger and political tension over fatal mistakes led NATO to adopt policies for investigating actions that cause civilian harm, including guidelines for expressing condolences and making small payments to victims or their families. Here, not even these crocodile tears are being shed. You would think, and I did think, said Sarah Holowinski, the executive director of CIVIC, that all the lessons learned from Afghanistan would have been transferred to Libya, but many of them didn't. That's because this was largely a remote control operation. You don't have to worry about blood on their own hands. In choosing targets, when the foreign militaries began attacking Libya's pro-Gaddafi forces on March 19th, the United States military, well, allegedly more experienced than NATO at directing large operations, coordinated the campaign, which shows, of course, that the campaign under the NATO umbrella was largely concocted by the United States. On March 31st, the Americans then transferred formal command to NATO itself. 7 months later, the tally shows that there were more than 5,900 military targets destroyed by means of roughly 9,700 strike sorties, according to the data of NATO, helping to dismantle the pro-Gaddafi military and militias. Warplanes flew from France, Britain, the United States, Italy, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and Canada. Two non-NATO nations, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, participated on a small scale. France carried out about a third of all strike sorties, Britain 21%, the United States 19 to 20%, according to data from each nation. The attacks fell under two broad categories. So-called deliberate strikes were directed against fixed targets like buildings or air defense systems. These targets were selected and assigned to pilots before aircraft took off. Deliberate strikes were planned to minimize risk to civilians, NATO said. In Naples, intelligence analysts and targeting specialists vetted proposed targets and compiled lists, which were then sent to an operations center near Bologna. Not the only piece of Bologna associated with this outfit, where targets were matched to specific aircraft and weapons. For some targets, like command bunkers, NATO says it conducted long periods of surveillance first. Drones or other aircraft chronicled the daily routines of the sites, known as patterns of life, until that life could be extinguished by assigning each valid target to a strike. Other considerations then came into play. Targeting specialists chose, for example, the angle of attack and time of day thought to pose the least risk to civilians. They would also consider questions of ordnance. These included the size and type of bomb and its fuse. Some fuse were of the detonation delay type, which can allow ordnance to penetrate concrete and explode in an underground tunnel or bunker, busters in other words, or to burrow into sand before exploding, reducing the blast wave, the shrapnel, and the risk to people and property nearby. NATO could also choose inert bombs made of concrete that can collapse buildings or shatter tanks with kinetic energy rather than an explosion. Again, a variety of bunker buster. NATO said such weapons were used fewer than 10 times in the war. If you don't believe them, just ask them. Many early strikes were planned missions, but about 2/3 of all strikes, and most of the attacks late in the war, were another sort, dynamic strikes. This means strikes against targets of opportunity. In other words, just letting the fur fly and the chips land where they may. Crews on aerial patrols would spot or be told of a potential target, like suspected military vehicles, such as anything that moved. Then, if cleared by controllers and AWACS aircraft, they would attack. NATO said dynamic missions, too, were guided by practices meant to limit risks. On October 24th, Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard of Canada, the operations commander, described a philosophy beyond careful target vetting or using only guided weapons restraint. Only when we had a clear shot would we take it, he said, thereby compounding what we know to be true of deliberate targeting of anything that moved on the ground. Colonel Julian, the spokesman of NATO, said there were hundreds of instances when pilots could have released ordnance, but because of concerns for civilians, they held fire. Colonel Alain Pelletier, commander of 7 Canadian CF-18 fighters that flew 946 dry sorties, on this kind of data, they're awful precise. Well, Colonel Pelletier said Canada installed special computer software modification in its planes that allowed pilots to assess the likely blast radius around an intended target and to call off strikes if the technology warranted they posed too great a risk to civilians, but apparently they struck anyway. Also, Colonel Julian says NATO broadcast radio messages and that it dropped millions of leaflets to warn Libyans to stay away from likely military targets, a practice Libyan citizens across much of the country did confirm. But civilians were killed by NATO within days of the alliance's intervention. According to all the available evidence, beginning with one of the uglier mistakes of the air war, the pummeling of a secret rebel armored convoy that was advancing through the desert toward the Gaddafi forces' eastern front lines. Having survived the first wave of ground attacks, the loyalists were taking steps to avoid attracting NATO bombs, so they moved in smaller formations and sometimes set aside armored vehicles in favor of pickup trucks resembling those that the rebels drove. Pilots suddenly had fewer targets. On April 7th, as the rebel armor lined up on a hill about 20 miles from Brega, NATO aircraft struck. In a series of attacks, laser-guided bombs stopped the formation, destroyed the rebels' armor, and scattered the anti-Gaddafi fighters, killing several of them, according to survivors. The attack continued as civilians, including ambulance crews, tried to converge on the craters and flames to aid the wounded. 3 shepherds were among them. As these shepherds approached over the sand, a bomb slammed in again in the usual repeat attack formation, and according to one of them, knocked them over. His 2 cousins were hit. One, he said, was cut in half. The other had a gaping chest wound. Both, of course, died. Mr. Sudani and other relatives returned to the wreckage later and retrieved the remains for burial in Kufa. The men had died, he said, trying to help. We called their families in Sudan and told them, "Your sons, they have passed away." Colonel Julian, of course, true to form, declined to discuss this episode, but said that each time NATO aircraft returned to strike again was a distinct event and a distinct decision, and that it was not a general practice for NATO to double-tap its targets. Which only begs the question, of course, because if you're making up your mind to return and making another dropping as a distinct decision, that means you are, in effect, double-running your target. This practice was reported several times by survivors at separate attacks, and cited to explain why some civilians opted not to help at strike sites or bolted in fear soon after they did, confirming, of course, that this practice is NATO terror bombing and is, therefore, a war crime. Colonel Julian said the tactic was likely to be included in NATO's internal review of the air campaign. Example of a so-called errant strike, in which no matter how thorough NATO's planning or restraint did not protect the family of Ali Mukhtar in al-Grani, is seen here in June, and the so-called phenomenon of errant ordnance. A retiree in Tripoli Mr. Ali Mukhbar al-Gharari owned a three-story house he shared with his adult children and their families. Late on June 19th, a bomb struck it squarely, collapsing the front side. The rubble buried a courtyard apartment the family said were Karima. Mr. Gharari's adult daughter lived with her husband and two children, Yomana, 2, and Khaled, 7 months old. All four were killed, as was another of Mr. Gharari's adult children, Farouz, who was blasted from his second-floor bed to the rubble below. 8 other family members were wounded, one seriously. The Gaddafi government allegedly given to exaggeration claims that 9 civilians died in the airstrike, including a rescue worker electrocuted while clearing rubble. So Gaddafi's forces exaggerate by 9. The actual total on the ground we can confirm is 5. Such errant propaganda. These deaths have not been independently corroborated, but there has been no dispute about the Gharari deaths. Initially, NATO almost acknowledged its mistake. A military missile was the intended target. There may have been a weapon system failure near the site, which may have caused a number of civilian casualties. Then, of course, it backtracked as usual. Christella Younes, the Civic Operations Field Director, examined the site and delivered her findings to NATO, and, of course, met the usual bullshit brush-off. NATO said, "We have no confirmed reports of civilian casualties." The reason Ms. Younes gave was that the alliance had created its own definition for confirmed. Only a death that NATO itself investigated and corroborated could be called confirmed. But because the alliance refuses to testify against itself for its own war crimes, its casualty tag by definition could not budge from 0. And of course, NATO would not budge from such an absurd position. They made it very clear there was no appetite within NATO to look at these incidents. The position left the Gharari family disoriented, homeless, in social jeopardy of survival. Another of Mr. Gharari's sons, Mohammed, said the family supported the revolution, but since NATO's attacks, other Libyans have labeled the family pro-Gaddafi. If NATO attacked the Gharari's home, the straight logic went, the alliance must have had a reason. Mohammed al-Gharari said he would attempt to extract an apology from NATO and accept it if offered. He said he could even accept the mistake. This was an error from their control room. I won't say anything harsh because that was our destiny. But he asked that NATO lift the dishonor from the family and set the record straight. NATO should tell the truth, he said. They should tell what happened so everyone knows our family's innocent. Well, good luck with that. In the hours before his wife and 2 of their sons were killed on August 4th, Mustafa Naji al-Morabit thought he had taken adequate precautions. When Colonel Gaddafi's officers began meeting at a home next door, at his home in Zlatan, he moved his family. That was in July. The adjacent property, Mr. Morabit and his neighbor said, was owned by a loyalist doctor who hosted commanders who organized the local front. Well, about a month later, as rebels pressed near, the officers fled. He and his family returned home on August 2nd, assuming that the danger had passed. Well, the calamity struck 2 days later. A bomb roared down in the early morning quiet and slammed into their concrete home, causing its front to buckle. Mr. Morabit's wife, Ibtisam Ali al-Babar, died of a crushed skull. 2 of their 3 sons, Mohammed 6 and Moataz 3, were killed also. 3 toes in the left foot of Fatima Umar Mansour, Mr. Morabit's mother, were severed. Her lower leg was snapped. Showing the swollen left leg, she says, "We were just in our homes at night." The destruction of their home showed that even with careful standards for target selection, mistakes occurred, which of course shows that they're not really mistakes. Not only did NATO hit the wrong building, survivors and neighbors said, but it also hit it more than 2 days late, which means that the strike was a deliberate showing of terror bombing techniques. Mr. Morabit added a sorrowful detail. He suspected that the bomb was made of concrete also. There seemed to be no fire or explosion when it struck, he said. NATO may have tried to minimize damage, but the would-be benefits of its caution were lost. "I want to know why," he said. "NATO said they're so organized, they're specialists, so why this horrible mistake?" The question which of course answered itself. It's not clear whether the mistake was made by the pilot or those who selected the target. NATO declined to answer questions about the strike, as usual. On August the 8th, 4 days after destroying the Morabit home, NATO hit buildings occupied by civilians again, this time in Niger, according to survivors, doctors, and independent investigators. The strikes were NATO's bloodiest known accidents in the war. The attacks began with a series of 500-pound laser-guided bombs, called GBU-12s. Ordnance remnants on the ground suggest that the first house owned by Ali Hamid Gafez, 61, was crowded with Mr. Gafez's relatives, who had been dislocated by the war. The bomb destroyed the second floor and much of the first. 5 women and several children were killed. Several more people were wounded, including Mr. Gafez's wife, whose lower left leg had to be amputated. The doctor performing the procedure said that minutes later, NATO aircraft attacked 2 buildings in a second compound, owned by brothers in the Giroud family. There, 4 people were killed. Several minutes after the first strikes, as neighbors rushed to dig for victims, another follow-up bomb struck. The blast killed 18 civilians, both families said. No question that this is premeditated, but of course, NATO will deny it, especially when the Gaddafi government estimated 85 civilian deaths. Of course, with the Gaddafi propaganda machine now gone, an official list of dead issued by the new government has reduced it to 35 victims, among them the late-term fetus of a fatally wounded woman. Of course, there will be no cutting off of NATO funds for carrying out abortions. The Zlatan hospital confirmed 34 deaths. 5 doctors there also told of treating dozens of wounded people, including many women and children, but it has not confirmed how many of these wounded also lapsed terminally. All 16 beds in the intensive care unit were filled with severely wounded civilians. Dr. Ahmad Thabut, the hospital's co-director, said none of the victims, alive or dead, were in uniform. There is no doubt. This is not fabricated. Civilians were killed. Descriptions of the wounded underscore the difference between mistakes with typical ground-to-ground arms and the unforgiving nature of mistakes with 500-pound bombs, which created blast waves of an entirely different order. Dr. Mustafa Ekial, a surgeon, said the wounds caused by NATO's bombs were far worse than those the staff had treated for months. We have to tell the truth, he says. What we saw that night was completely different. In previous statements, NATO said it watched their homes carefully before attacking and saw military staging areas. It also said that it reviewed the strikes and that claims of civilian casualties were not corroborated by available factual information. When asked what this information was, the alliance did not provide it, which means, of course, that the alliance did target these civilian areas on purpose as part of a terror campaign. If this statement is an error, then it's up to NATO to prove that it did not do so. Mr. Gafez issued a challenge. An independent review of all pre-strike surveillance video, he said, would prove NATO wrong. Only civilians were there, he said, and he demanded that the alliance release the video. Ms. Yunus said that the disputed was missing an essential point. Under NATO's targeting guidelines and in keeping with practices the alliance has repeatedly insisted that it followed, if civilians were present, aircraft should not have attacked. The initial findings on the Major strike, part of the UN investigation into actions by all sides in Libya that harmed civilians, have raised questions about the legality of the attack under international humanitarian law. Homes, of course, were targeted. NATO strikes in Niger, one of 5 known attacks on apparently occupied residences, suggest a pattern. When residential targets were presumed to be used by loyalist forces, civilians were sometimes present, suggesting holes in NATO's patterns of life reviews and other forms of vetting, or suggesting that pattern of life review was a deliberate targeting of the homes. Airstrikes on June 20th in Surman leveled homes owned by Major General El-Khalwadi al-Hamidi, a longtime confidant of Colonel Gaddafi and a member of his Revolutionary Council. NATO has said the family compound was used as a command center. The family's account, partly confirmed by rebels, claimed that the strikes killed 13 civilians and wounded 6 more. Local Gaddafi resistance fighters corroborated the deaths of those killed, one of the general's daughters-in-law and 3 of her children. General Hamidi was wounded and has taken refuge in Morocco, according to his son Khaled. Khaled has filed a lawsuit against NATO, claiming that the attack was a crime. He said that he and his family were victims of rebel fabrications which attracted NATO bombs. On September 25th, a smaller but similar attack destroyed the residence of Brigadier General Musba Diab in Sirte. General Diab, a distant cousin of Colonel Gaddafi, was killed, likely for that reason alone. So were 7 women and children who crowded into his home as rebels besieged the defenses of some of the Gaddafi loyalists' last holdouts. By this time, tables in Libya had turned. The remaining loyalists held almost no territory. They were a dwindling, disorganized lot. It was the anti-Gaddafi forces who endangered civilians they suspected of having sympathies for the dying government. On a recent afternoon, Mohammed Zarag Massoud, his hand swollen with an infection from a wound, wandered the broken shell of a 7-story apartment building in Sirte, which was struck in mid-September. His apartment furniture had been blown about by the blast. As he approached the kitchen, where he and his wife had just broken the Ramadan fast when ordnance hit, he said, "We were not thinking NATO would attack our home." Which is, of course, what you get for thinking. Judged by the damage and munitions remains, a bomb with a delayed fuse struck another wing of the building, burrowed into another apartment, and exploded, blasting walls outward. Debris flew across the courtyard and through his kitchen's balcony door. His wife, Aisha Abu Jadil, was killed, both her arms severed. Bloodstains still marked the floor and walls. Providing written questions, NATO declined to comment on the three strikes on homes in Serman and Sirte. So, there you have it, deliberate targeting of civilians, NATO's denials as usual, and, well, I have no doubt who this is probably from. The official NATO spokesman. Hello? No, General Curtis LeMay. Yeah, you wanted to add your comment to the NATO comments here, that we always have to remember that peace is your profession, and that you believe in peace the old-fashioned way. Kill them all and let God sort them out.